have any questions, you can use it in your GoToWebinar screen in front of you. Ask the question there, or you can use it on Twitter, hashtag Fpwebinar. Leave any comments and questions. So getting started again, this is Come Prepared, What to Bring to the Cloud conversation. And this will be available online afterwards, and we'll be sending it to all the attendees. The one main thing to keep in mind is that this is a special FP webinar because we're going to make somebody's holidays a bit brighter by giving away a copy of Microsoft Office Professional 2013. That's a $400 value, and it's going to one of the attendees that stays with us to the end of the presentation. All of you online are eligible right now. So without further ado, once more I'd like to present our presenters, Mr. Chris Schwab and Mr. Jesse Roche. Gentlemen.
Thanks, Peter. You know, when we sat down, we were kind of going over that list of topics. We tried to figure out, you know, what would be a good one for right now. You know, it's kind of that weird time of the year where we have the holidays coming up. We're probably closing out some projects. We're looking, you know, towards next year to figure out, you know, what are we going to actually accomplish next year. So, you know, and moving to the cloud might be one of those initiatives that we're getting ready to tackle. So we thought that it'd be kind of a good time to throw some of this stuff out there to give you an idea of what things you need to be prepared to talk about if you are looking at one of these cloud initiatives. Now, if you've joined us in any of these FP webinars before, our specialty happens to be SharePoint in the cloud, but a lot of this stuff will transfer if you're doing, you know, if you have some other kind of cloud initiative. So before I get too far into this, let's get the introductions out of the way. So I'm Chris Schwab. I'm the president here at Fpweb.net. I've been here about, I don't know, a little over 5 years now. I've done, you know, the engineering work, support work. I've done some marketing. I've done some sales. So I've talked to hundreds, if not thousands, of people kind of trying to make this cloud leap. And these are questions that we've talked about, and I've got a lot of interesting answers from them. So you know, there's a lot of information here that we're going to cover, and my partner is Jesse. Jesse, why don't you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Chris. As Chris mentioned, I'm Jesse Roche. I'm our VP of Sales here at Fpweb. Much like Chris, I've actually done a few different jobs here within Fpweb, everything from being the support manager here to the relationship manager role. So I've done a few different things, and obviously had these questions asked of me, and worked with many of our customers, probably some of you that are on the call today, and tried to walk us through some of these questions. So yeah, that's kind of my background.
Cool. So let's go ahead and just jump in. We'll get through this pretty quick, and we'll have some time for some questions at the end. So you know, the first thing, and this may sound kind of obvious, you know, but the first thing that Jesse or I are going to want to know is we're going to want to talk about kind of that current environment, right? So generally, when we see people coming to us, they're either taking an environment that they already have and moving it to us, or possibly they're starting up something else for, you know, another environment for a specific purpose. So we need to talk about kind of what that current environment looks like, what you're doing with that today. If you don't have one, what are you trying to accomplish with this new environment? Because, you know, SharePoint's really the starting point for a lot of this, you know, for a lot of this stuff. So we're going to build on top of that, and we need to make sure that we have a good understanding. Like I said, we've done this a lot, so if we can get kind of a big picture laid out there, we're going to have a better understanding of what you're really trying to accomplish and how we can lay this thing out there to really best suit that. So do your homework, right? Dig into your current environment. Take a look at what you have, how it's running today, because a lot of the times the people that are contacting us, especially the first time, aren't necessarily the same people that are maybe supporting or running that environment on a daily basis. So, you know, it might be the IT director, you know, it might even be a CEO that's contacting us. So do a little bit of homework so that we can kind of get a picture of what you're doing and what you're trying to take to us. You know, and along with that, get an idea of you know, these environments are all about users and what they're trying to do with that. So get an idea of what your users are trying to do with that. I think Jesse's going to talk a little bit more about users. So
great, thanks, Chris. So again, there's a few different ways that we would need to know about the users, right? So we need to know how many users are accessing the site. You know, we also need to know the concurrency of those users. So is it a 10% concurrency? Is it a 50% concurrency if it's your intranet, whatever that might be. So that's one way we look at users. But there's actually a couple different ways as well. So, you know, for example, are all of those users internal users, meaning are they employees of the company? So that doesn't necessarily mean that they live at the same location, They could be, throughout the world, remote employees, but are they employees of your company? If so, that would be called what we call basically an intranet. Everybody is internal. So that's one way that, SharePoint works. Another way would be if you wanted to use this for your external partners as well. So you maybe have an intranet, and then you also want to expand this to include some of your external partners that you work with. Maybe you've got contracts or something like that. That would be called an extranet, and you can certainly do both of those together. But for licensing purposes, which we'll talk about a little later, we kind of need to know what those users are, whether they're internal or external. The third scenario would basically be if you have an anonymous access site. So something that a lot of companies are doing today is they're actually using SharePoint as their public-facing website. So they're just normal dub site. You can actually go out to topsharepoint.com and look at some of those sites. It's pretty neat to kind of see that they look nothing like you would typically see as a normal SharePoint site. So again, there's more licensing implications with that, and we also need to know for certain things like DDoS attacks, which is a distributed denial of service attack, right? If you have a public-facing website, anybody can really go after it then. There's no real, I wouldn't say there's not any security, but it could certainly be flooded with attacks essentially. So I need to know that on our side to make sure, A, we're protecting you, and also for the licensing piece as well. So that's just a few of the different ways that we kind of look at users and the different types of users.
And when we're taking a look at those users too, Jesse, not only really what types of users, but what are they really going to be doing with this, right? So SharePoint specifically is kind of just a out-of-the-box solution, and there's a fair amount of value there. But a lot of times we need to do some custom development work on top of that to really add, some power to the solution. So that's kind of the next one that we need to talk about a little bit is what are your expectations for that custom development? Do you have developers that are internal that are going to be working on this? Do you have an external group that you're already comfortable working with? Or do you know that you need some development but you have no idea where to go? We can help you kind of track down and recommend some partners to be able to do that as well. So and I know this, we're kind of gearing this towards this is sort of that initial conversation, but it's important to get those folks involved very early so they can kind of be vested into this deployment, into this environment as well, because a lot of times they're kind of the last people to hear about this, right? So, we'll go through, we'll scope something out, we'll get something completely built, and then we'll go to the developers, and it's, oh, by the way, we need, 3 or 4 more things installed, and those things a lot of times might be much easier installed up front than they are to kind of go back and tweak that environment. So we really want them involved in that process early. We want to get their ideas and their input on how they want this environment to look, because if we don't, it can really start to draw out kind of that timeline or that budget to actually run this thing out. And I think Jesse's going to talk a little bit more about why those budgets and timelines are important and why we need to kind of talk about that up front as well.
Yeah, so again, turn it back over to the sales guy for the salesy questions. But we do kind of need to know the go live dates and the budgets that are in place for the project. And again, it's not really about I need to know your budget because it's going to affect my pricing. It doesn't affect the price in any way, but the reason I need to know that is to make sure that we're not talking apples and oranges, right? So if your budget's $100 a month and you're wanting this large SharePoint farm, I need to be able to kind of educate you on the differences between, say, multi-tenant, which is a public cloud versus a private cloud where we're dedicating resources to you. So it helps me understand the level of education that I need to do and that explanation that needs to occur. The other piece of that is also going to be the timeline. So there are different things that come into play along the timeline. If we're building out a 6-server farm for someone, it's not like that stood up in a matter of a couple days. There are a lot of questions that are involved with that. There's also a lot of different people involved from both our side and your side, right? So if there's a VPN tunnel that's involved, we need to get your networking team involved and our infrastructure team involved to kind of go through setting all of that up. So it's not something that you can just necessarily turn over in a couple days. Now, that being said, if it is a tight timeline, we've also worked with customers and done 10 server farms in under a week. So it's occurred before, but it's just something that I would need to know so we can make sure that we're going along that process. So again, those are two of the fairly important questions that, again, I know are kind of salesy to people, but there is kind of a method to the madness behind the scenes.
Well, we need to be able to get those resources kind of lined up and make sure that that we can hit those timelines if they are tight. And one of the things that a lot of times will tighten up some of those timelines is how much data do we have, right? So a lot of times we're pulling some data into this environment, And if there's a lot of data, that's going to affect the timeline too. And again, this is kind of one of those things that sometimes is a little bit of an afterthought, but it takes a while to do a migration, to pull a lot of data into this. So we need to get an idea of how much data we're dealing with, and as well as how that data is living right now. So this kind of goes back to our first question about your current environment. What do you have right now that's sitting there? How is it architected? How is it living? What do your content databases look like? Because sometimes those content databases, if you've got an environment that's maybe been running for a while, maybe they've gotten pretty big, and this is a good opportunity to kind of split them up and get this thing back to sort of a best practices, where maybe we can't split it up. So now's the time to look at some other options to try to get the size of those databases down without really impacting kind of what the users see and their look and feel for this. So it also goes back to our development, right? We might need to bring in some people for some custom solutions to try to bring the size of those databases down, or maybe we can't do anything about it, and we just need to put some additional resources kind of underneath to make sure that backup and restore times are big enough that we can actually get that environment back up and running should something go wrong with an expected period of time. And then finally, we also need to know, like, how's that data going to grow, right? So are we expecting this to get bigger? Is this kind of more of a static data set? We can generally add size kind of as you go, but it's still nice to know, how we kind of envision this thing to scale so that we can partition it and set it up correctly so that we can be ready to be able to add that space when the time comes. So that's all stuff that, again, we really need to know what that current environment's doing, how the data really looks right now. And then that sort of leads us into the last one and possibly the most confusing one here, which is, what does your licensing look like? So while you're kind of diving into this data, while you're looking at that, let's take a look and see what our licensing options are as well.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm not going to talk for hours about licensing, as I often do on a daily basis, but I'm going to try and keep this pretty simple. So if there are questions, as Peter mentioned, certainly tweet them or let us know at the end, and we can try and clarify. But the first thing is do we need licensing? And that depends on a few things, right? So the first thing that kind of depends on is, well, what version of, in this case, SharePoint are you working with? So you've got Foundation, you've got Server Standard, and you've got Server Enterprise. Foundation is typically considered the free version, using air quotes, of SharePoint, which means you don't need a user CAL, which is a client access license to access the functionality of SharePoint. For Server, you're required to pay for that CAL basically for each user that has an ID on the SharePoint farm. So again, you're basically paying for that ability to access more features and functions. And obviously there's a different price for Standard or Enterprise, I guess, in this case. So again, the other piece of that is you also have to have a SharePoint server license if you're talking either Server Standard or Server Enterprise. And this is something that changed a little bit in 2013. For the people that are using this as maybe an extranet or a public-facing site that I talked about a little earlier, you used to have what was called a FIS license, or a For Internet Sites license. And that's no longer required. Now you just need that SharePoint server license and then any CALs for your internal users. So again, I know it's a little bit confusing because you also have on top of that, you're going to need Windows licensing, SQL licensing. So there's a lot to that. And not everybody understands all of that. So you kind of need to know who you can go to for all of that. And there's a few different people that you can go to. You can obviously talk to Microsoft. You can talk to your own licensing specialist at wherever you get your licensing with. And you can certainly also give us a call as well. I've seen more EA agreements than I care to look at, but I've also helped out a lot of our customers as far as letting them know what they can and can't use, right? So that kind of leads to the third point is what if you already have that licensing? There are certain partners, Fpweb being one of them, that is a licensing mobility partner. And essentially what that means is if you already have your SharePoint licensing on-premise, and you have a EA agreement, which is an enterprise agreement with Microsoft, and that could be whether you have a full enterprise agreement or an open value or open value subscription, as long as they have what's called software assurance with that, you're actually able to repurpose your SharePoint server and SharePoint CALs with us, along with even your SQL licensing. So, like I said, there's a lot to the licensing piece, but we can certainly help kind of walk you through that, as, like I said, can Microsoft and your licensing specialists that you work with. But again, if there's any questions on that, certainly kind of give us a call or even just let us know at the end of this webinar.
Thanks, Jesse. just to kind of recap here a little bit, there's a lot of things that you can do to make these conversations go smoother, make sure that we get a proper implementation on our side, and whether that's just exploring your current environment, taking a look at your users, looking at what your development requirements are, trying to get your budget and your go live date all nailed down, what does your data look like, and then finally kind of the licensing piece. If we can get a lot of those questions already answered, if you can at least get part of the way there, it really helps that these conversations go smoother and make sure that we get an accurate implementation that we don't have to tweak or change, after the fact, because some of this stuff might have not come up. So really do your homework in your own environment. Now is a good time, right? It's kind of a slow time. We're looking for things to kind of slide in between vacations, so this is a good kind of time to be exploring and looking around. And then, don't worry about if you don't have all the answers to this stuff. That's fine. Like Jesse was saying, we've helped people get through these answers as well. So get as much of it as you can, and then call us. Start asking questions. Get some, get some more input as far as where to go and find these things, or who else that we can contact to really start painting the picture of what we're looking at doing. And I think kind of along that same line, Peter, I think we've got a few questions just from the content we've covered today.
Yeah, we absolutely do. I've got a few questions lined up, but this is the time, guys. If you have any questions, just use that GoToWebinar screen. Use questions, send them in to me, and we'll make sure the gentleman answer that for you. A prepared question I have right now is asking, how do you grow the environment? You're talking about if I have 100 gigs, but I expect to grow to 500 gigs, how's that handled?
Can we take that one? So again, it's one of those that, people, if they're not used to a virtual world, essentially, which is what we are today, and you're planning an on-premise implementation, a lot of times you have to sit there and think, where am I going to be in 3 years, right? Am I going to be at 2 terabytes, and I need to go ahead and purchase that now? So when you're working with a hosting provider, that's not typically the case. What I like to do is sit down with the customers, and I want to know where they're going to be, but in the end, I really need to know where you're at today, and maybe where you're going to be in a couple months. But as far as scaling is concerned, which I think is what this question is asking, it's very easy for us to scale. There's usually little to no downtime, and it's something that I'm not going to charge you if you say, hey, in a year I'm going to be at 2 terabytes, but right now I'm at 200 gig. There's no need for me to charge you for that 2 terabytes now. We can scale with you. So as you kind of grow, and whether that's monthly or, hey, every quarter you need to add an extra 100 gig, we can certainly do that, and it's very simple on our end to do that, and like I said, little to no downtime.
Yeah, we just need enough space to really, be able to do backups effectively and migrations. So there needs to be a little bit of room to move around, but there doesn't need to be a lot of room, because we can't add, that space so quickly to that environment. So, good question.
All right. One question that's popped up. How easy is it to add storage, RAM, and VMs once the cloud environment is live?
Well, it kind of actually couples back onto that previous question. So again, whether it's storage or whether it's adding VMs or even just RAM, it's actually fairly simple. Now again, when you're talking about adding RAM or storage, that's obviously a little more simple than if you're adding a VM, but even adding a VM is not something complicated. It certainly depends on the environment that you start with, whether that's a 1 server, 2 server, or 10 server build. It's obviously easier to add it if you're load balanced and clustered already to where there's no downtime. But even if you're on a single server and you simply want to add a SQL server to your environment, that's something that we can fairly easily do, and actually do it pretty quickly as well. One of the nice things that, not to toot our own horn, but we actually have relationship managers that we dedicate to each account, and they kind of work with our customers throughout the process. So even after you are a customer of Fpweb, these relationship managers will kind of work with you to say, what are your needs, how are they growing, and what are those next steps? Do we need to add a server? Can we simply just add some RAM or some storage? So
yeah, with SharePoint specifically, it gets easier, like Jesse said, the bigger that environment already is, because generally at that point the roles are more sort of broken out, right? If it's a small environment, if we're going from 1 server to 2 or 2 servers to 3, a lot of times we have to sort of pick apart some of those roles, and that could cause a reboot or a small amount of downtime. It's not a big deal, but actually adding in the resources is pretty easy and pretty seamless. So
okay. Kyla asked a question about security, and I actually saw your email this morning, Kyla, and we'll be getting back to you soon. Kyla says, the biggest issue I have with cloud conversation with our execs is around security concerns. they don't believe the cloud is very secure, and I'm not well versed enough to help ease those security concerns. Right off the bat, Kyle, I would say you want to take a look at our hybrid webinar that we did, which is going to address one way to handle that. And I'll leave it to you guys, but I know we're going to be covering this in a future webinar, specifically security of the cloud. So I don't know if you guys want to add something to that, or we'll definitely be in touch with you, Kyla, to give you some more material.
Well, it's a pretty common question, right? And unfortunately, there's not like one answer that sort of covers the entire spectrum of security. So it's very dependent on what you're looking at securing specifically. So the question comes up, and this exact scenario comes up all the time. Jesse and I have probably heard it 50, 60 times at least. And what I generally tell people is go back and specifically identify what security it is that you're concerned about, right? What data is it that you're concerned about getting out there or getting lost or getting accessed? And then at that point we can specifically address those concerns. And it may be that, maybe there's a certain subset of data that we need to leave, on-prem, because that's where it's going to reside, it's going to be most secure, but we can take and we can actually create, like what Peter was saying, with a hybrid scenario, and we can take a lot of the load off of you by taking a lot of the data that maybe isn't as secure and a lot of the day-to-day stuff and move that up to a cloud environment, or maybe it's an extranet where we bring some people into sort of a medium security environment with a highly secured environment behind it, or there's a lot of different security options. So maybe we do want to move it all up. Maybe it is highly secure. Maybe we need to lock it down in some specific manner. We have customers that don't even have their environment open to the outside world, right? They all come in through a VPN connection, or we put more, some additional firewalls or layers in front of that. So there's a lot of different ways to mediate that, but it really starts by identifying the specific security needs that you're actually looking for, instead of sort of one blanket, how do I make this secure? Well, we need to get into some more specifics. So I don't know if you have anything else, Jeff.
Yeah, and so just to jump in a little bit, and Kyla, it really depends. It's one of those conversations that we can certainly have offline, but to get even a little more in depth on that, depending on what you're trying to protect, one of the things I hear is that since we're managing the infrastructure on our side, how do they know that we're not getting into that data, right? So obviously we don't go around and look at everybody's data, but there's actually third-party software and partners that we partner with that actually can go in and block us from seeing that. Even though we have all these administrator accounts, there are partners that create software specifically for this purpose, so that whether it's your board that is the only people that can see a certain amount of data, they can actually block that from even our admin rights and things like that. So there's every scenario we can kind of account for. It's just a matter of kind of knowing what your scenario is, so we can really talk to that, and whether we bring in a third-party partner or whether it's just encrypting the data with SQL Enterprise or something like that. There's that kind of whole spectrum.
And this is a big conversation, so I don't want to draw it out too much, but it really comes down to that whole thing, right, between the security and the convenience of the data. I mean, we can lay down all of the security that we want to, but we may not need it all, and it's going to make the environment very inconvenient to operate in. So we want to make sure that we're balancing out and we're protecting the stuff that needs to be protected, and that we're allowing access, and that we're allowing kind of an ease of use of the stuff that is maybe lower on the priority list. So.
Okay, and I got a few more questions, and we're definitely going to get to those. But I thought, since it's been a half an hour in, thanks to a 5-minute technical glitch earlier, just in case people have other meetings they want to rush to, I do want to tell you that we have randomly picked a winner, one of the attendees right now, and that winner is Mike Valderrama, and you've won the Microsoft Office Professional 2013. We're going to get that to you. We're going to email you right after this, and you'll get the prize. So thank you again for participating, and to all of you. But now we'll get on to a few more questions. One I have here, and actually I've seen a couple questions. Stephen, I know you had a question, I think, that got covered with some of the other things the guys were saying. If not, let me know if you need a little more clarification. One question I see that we haven't covered is, how exactly do we know if we have licensing mobility?
Sure, and I'll take that one. So again, that's a great question. So there's a few different ways, and I kind of talked about it a little bit in the actual webinar itself. But you can talk to your Microsoft rep, you can talk to whoever your actual software vendor is, or you can give us a call as well. But the licensing mobility piece comes along with software assurance. So that is where it really comes into play. So if your enterprise agreement has software assurance, and it's typically labeled on the agreement itself, so if you're actually looking at your enterprise agreement, and again, I say enterprise agreement, it can be an open value or an open value subscription agreement as well. Typically there's an extra fee for the software assurance piece, but software assurance is where the licensing mobility comes into play, and that's where you can basically repurpose that and use it for a hosting company like ourselves. Now, the other caveat to that is not all hosting companies are licensing mobility partners, so you need to make sure that the company you're working with is a licensing mobility partner as well. So again, all very confusing, but at the same time, anytime there's a question with that, there usually are experts out there to help you. And like I said, I usually have a lot of our customers that will kind of send me their EAs and say, hey, what do I have and what do I need and does this have this? And we can normally point them in the right direction as well.
Okay. Another question I have here. I believe Chris was talking about it during the webinar, but he's asking what options are available for custom development.
So it depends on the provider. With us specifically, these VMs, virtual machines, are actually open so that somebody can come in and have full access to them and do really any kind of development that they want to on that environment. So if you have your own internal group, they can come in and they can do development just like if it was a VM that you were hosting in your own data center. If we have an outside group, we can bring them in. Now again, we need to decide from a security aspect how much access they may have to that. So maybe we have a development environment that they have access to, and then we can roll out the code. You can roll out the code that they're actually producing. There's a lot of different ways to do that, but they really have access to that whole thing. And then as far as finding those people, again, it just kind of comes back to what are you trying to accomplish. And then we have a list of partners, and I dare say that most hosting providers are probably going to have a list of people that they're comfortable working with, that they've kind of vetted out, and they can help you go and find and identify those people and bring them in and create whatever custom changes that you need to the product. So.
Yeah, and just to add on top of that, we actually have a channel manager that we work with that is Fpweb.net employee that, again, I work with him every day because I get a new request for something that I kind of, reach out to him and say, hey, here's what a customer's looking for. Who do we have that, we've worked with in the past that does either this type of development or they're looking for a specific functionality that SharePoint either doesn't do out of the box and they want it created. And again, we kind of work with our channel to really kind of find out who is good at doing that, right? Because SharePoint's one of those tools that really there's a base, but then it's just exponentially grows. So again, you can either work with myself or even if you're a current customer, our relationship manager, and they can usually point you in the right direction.
All right, thank you so much, guys. I'm going to stop it right there. Again, Jim, I think some of your questions got answered. If not, and anybody, if you have any further questions, please email us, tweet us. We're going to get right back to you. We're going to get you all the answers you need.